Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by three very important and very distinguished sponsors. First up we have ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Regular listeners of Knowing Animals will know ASA very well. They have supported Knowing Animals for quite a few years now. ASA is the membership body for academics, artists and advocates interested in animal issues. Now ASA does very good work to support animal studies scholars. You can follow ASA at their Facebook page. You can also join ASA by going to their website, the Australasian Animal Studies Association ASA website. Supporting ASA is a way to support animal studies, so please think about joining ASA, the organisation that supports animal studies scholars and artists. Our second sponsor is a new sponsor. Our second sponsor is actually a book. The book is called After Coetzee, an anthology of animal fictions. Now, After Coetzee is published by Faunery Press. That's Faunay Press. Now, people who have been following animal issues for many years will know that Coetzee has had a very big impact on animal studies. Coetzee is a very, very well-regarded writer. He is a winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he often addresses very tricky and important animal issues. So this book is a very good way about thinking about the impact that Coetzee has had on animal fictions. So I highly recommend the book to you. You can find out more about where to find the book in the notes for this podcast. And my recommendation is that you go and buy a copy, one for yourself, but also order one for your university library. So that's the book After Coetzee, an anthology of animal fictions. Grab one for your university or local library. Right, our final sponsor is Kibble. That is Kibbl. Now, Kibble is a new app that has been developed to data mine information from the web about adoptable pets from pounds and animal sanctuaries. And it's also an app that you can use to raise money for animal charities. So I have been following Kibble on Facebook, and I have to warn you, they have some very, very adorable animals that are currently at pounds or animal shelters looking for their forever home. But Kibble isn't just something that can be followed on Facebook. They're also an app. So go to your local app store, Google Play or such, and download Kibble. It's a free app, and by using it, you'll be helping animals find their forever home. You can learn more about Kibble by going to their website, which is kibbl.io, and you can learn more information about the organisation and the work they do by, again, having a look at the podcast notes. So there are our three sponsors for this episode, and I thank them very much for their support. Okay, now this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from Switzerland. I'm really, really lucky to be here to attend an animals and political representation workshop. And while I'm here, I thought I would take the opportunity to have a chat with Dr. Charlotte Blattner. Now, this is the point where I realised I should have checked on exactly how you pronounced your name, Blattner.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, Charlotte is a animal legal scholar, and she currently holds the very prestigious position as a postdoc at Queen's University, Canada, where she's working with Professor Will Kimlicker. So a very, very sought after and esteemed post, which says to me immediately that Charlotte is doing very, very good work. And today we're going to discuss Charlotte's book chapter, Rethinking the 3 R's, From Whitewashing to Rights, which appeared in the 2017 book, The Ethics of Experimentation, which was published by Brill. Welcome to the podcast, Charlotte.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, listeners probably breathing a sigh of relief that I've stopped talking and now we can hear from you. So, Charlotte, can you start by telling me why you wrote this work?
Are you asking about the article specifically?
Yeah.
So there was a call for chapter contributions by Kim and Catherine, who were editors of the book, and they're both specialized in animal research. One of them is a veterinarian, the other one is a specialist when it comes to animal behavior. And they both felt that it was frustrating to work in the field of animal research and that a paradigm change should be induced. And the question really is, how are we gonna work towards a paradigm change if after so many years of a strong and basically comprehensive body of law being in place for research animals still not having worked out yet. And so it's basically a multidisciplinary approach by the editors to reflect on this paradigm change. And it's very much influenced by the EU Directive 2010 that also, really said that the ultimate goal is the full replacement of animals in research.
Well, Charlotte, could you begin by explaining to listeners what you mean by the 3 R's?
So the 3 R's is basically the most widely and commonly accepted concept in animal research law. So it's refinement, replacement, and reduction. And usually refinement means we refine the conditions under which animals are being placed in research, be that social interaction with other animals, be it interesting food, be it mental stimulation or outside access, etc. And then reduction simply is a reduction of numbers of animals used in research. And then finally, replacement calls for replacing animals wherever there are alternatives. And so that's the basic concept, but it's differently interpreted, and it can be more narrowly or more widely interpreted. And so the 3 R's have basically been in place from a worldwide perspective, one could say, since the 1980s, maybe. A vast majority of states accept and publish or also promote these principles, and international organizations like the World Organization for Animal Health, the World Trade Organizations, or the Council of Europe, for example, all endorse those principles too. But if one looks at the numbers of animals used in research, we're still at the same numbers as in the 1980s. There was a notable drop in the 1990s, but it's been climbing up again ever since. And so I look at whether we should in fact abrogate the concept since it seems as if it hasn't worked out yet, or whether there's room for considerably reforming the concept. Yep.
So you argue that it's problematic, and is that based entirely on its failing to deliver a reduction in the use of animals in research, or are there other things about the 3 R's concept that you think is problematic?
Well, this is basically from the number of animals telling that there's been a failure. One could also say, well, in terms of refinement, we have made huge advancements. That's mostly true, I think, from a European perspective. If I talk to researchers working in the US, it's still barren cages, it's still no interaction with other animals, and there's a lack of monitoring throughout. So I think it's also fair to say that likely the refinement principle itself has also not been successful. So when we look at, so you could basically say it's either a total failure or a partial failure of the 3 R's. And what I propose in my paper is, the citizens' initiative of the EU basically demanded that the 3 R's be abrogated. Over 1,150,000 citizens called for the EU to abrogate the directive and not to operate with the 3 R's anymore. And the EU said, well, our goal is also to replace animals, but we think we cannot ban it right now because we fear that production will be outsourced. that's a major issue. We might come back to this problem afterwards. But basically, I also think there are good arguments to say, well, if the 3 Rs are accepted worldwide already, it's easier to it's like a, foot in the door strategy. You have a certain acceptance already, so it's easier to reform something than to come up with a wholly new concept. So what I propose in my paper basically is, first of all, a reverse hierarchy of the 3 Rs. So the 3 Rs were established by Russell and Birch, and they have clearly indicated that it's a humanitarian motivation to ameliorate the situation for animals that motivated them to come up with the concept. So in many states, it's still understood that refinement comes first, then reduction, and finally replacement. And very often, they think they've discharged their duty by just practicing refinement. And so you practice actually the 1 R instead of the 3 Rs, and that's a major problem. So what I propose is really having a reverse hierarchy to first go with the replacement. And one notable aspect there is really, and there's been a change in the EU directive with regard to that. Before, the relevant article said that the alternatives have to be practically and reasonably available. Right now, they omit that addition to replacement or alternatives, meaning that you have to come up with alternatives even if they're not yet in place, costly, or have never been used by the institution or the researcher itself. So that's one major amendment. And would you like me to continue with what I propose? Sorry. So the second thing I really propose is, I see a problem. Most of the states have an ethics committee, which is prima facie an advantages and promiseful tool to evaluate scientific proposals to do research on animals. The problem very much is that when balancing human interests versus animal interests, very often that is done with regard to the legal tools that encapsulate those interests. So we talk about the human right to do research, the human right to be alive and, to get treatment, versus animal interest in not being, infringed. And so what we often have is a rights versus protection debate. And many scholars speak of this balance of interest being structurally biased. And so the animal interest, even though it might be the most fundamental interest in being alive and, retaining bodily and mental integrity, is being violated for interests of humans that are not as qualitatively important, be it prestige interests. Very often institutions they don't have the necessary institutional capacities to really engage in replacement or in alternatives. So what you end up is perpetuating a certain system. And so in my article, I really propose to work with animal rights. And it doesn't mean that, there's a certain core content of these rights that may never be violated, but it doesn't mean that the interests themselves or the rights may never be violated. It just really means that there's a qualitative balance of interests. And the last point that I basically propose, and I think that is very important, like even if you have considerable and useful substantive amendments, it's very important to have in place the necessary formal structures that ensure that it's being applied and implemented in an, non-speciesist manner. So when ethics committees are set up in the US, for example, IACUCs are affiliated with a certain institution. And so that means you have mainly scientists on board that know the people who apply with their projects. The US says, it's made progress by having people representing animal interests in the committees. The problem is that very often those are veterinarians, and most veterinarians practice refinement. They don't have enough knowledge or expertise or even time to develop new knowledge in the field of replacement. And so the one major thing really is to take away this institutional dependence. In many European states, the ethics committee are on a federal or a cantonal level, but they're institutionally independent. So those are not people who know each other or work in the same scientific institutions. So there's also a personal independence, right? There's no quid pro quo relationship, etc. And I think it's also important to note that, if you have majority vote in an ethics committee and you just invite two representatives of animal interests to the board of a board of 10 people, it is, the consideration of animal interests is just a formalistic manner that may always be overrun by human interests. And so it's really important from my point of view to have equal representation of human and animal interests on the board. And a final point that really is important is education of scientists. That's what the article argues as well. It's not very often we're inclined to blame scientists for the continued exploitation of animals in research and for the failure of basically bringing about real change for these animals. But I very much see it as a regulatory failure on part of lawmakers. So we cannot, it's like I'm a lawyer, right? I work by using the legal methodology. And if someone comes to me right now and says, you have to arrive at the same results, but you're not going to use the methodology that you've used so far, I don't know what you're going to use, but just arrive at the same result and use a different method, most of the lawyers would probably also, act very defensively and say, I can't do that. And I wouldn't even know how how I'm going to do that. And so I would rather ensure that I would continue making use of the legal method. And so we have a responsibility to also put in place the educational framework that is necessary for scientists to gain expertise in animal research. That also means an institutional responsibility of people to ensure that their scientists are up to date with the newest legal method, and also, put in place financial incentives for them to explore new methods that do not make use of animals.
Yes, Charlotte, I agree with you entirely, and we have a very similar situation in Australia. Mm-hmm. We do not invest in replacement at all. We do not invest in alternatives, and there's no funding nor prestige associated with doing it. And I think, well, you know what, if $1 million was available for you to come up with a new way to undertake your research that was non-harmful, we might just have a few people getting interested in that field.
That's true, yeah.
So we face all the same problems in Australia as well. So last episode I spoke to somebody from Eurogroup for Animals, and they were talking about European animal welfare law having stalled. So having been very progressive, say about 6-7 years ago, and more recently finding it hard to get people more interested in positive change for animals in the EU. Is that your experience in relation to animal research law?
When I looked at the polls from a worldwide perspective with regard to research, and many people still continuing to support animal research say, well, a vast majority of people, say 50 to 60%, still view it as moral to use animals if, fundamental interests of humans are at stake. And the problem is that I think these numbers are a bit more complicated than appears at first sight. So first of all, I think it's difficult for lay people to evaluate whether there's a necessity to use animals or not. And very often ethics committees do not thoroughly discern scientific necessity from ethical necessity. So whether it's scientifically necessary to use an animal to get to a certain result is one question, and whether it's morally okay to use an animal for a certain purpose is another question, right? Like the scientific necessity case for human models would be even greater, right? But for ethical reasons, we pretty much put a hold on that, and so we're not doing that. And so the same differentiation should be applied to animal research, I think. And so when you look at the numbers, it's very easy for scientists to basically influence public opinion to tell them it's still necessary to do that, right, from a scientific perspective. And lay people also do not have the necessary background to know, the difference between scientific and ethical necessity. And the second thing about the polls really is that it's very often it's not made transparent that the people, even if they say that, if there are no other means available, we're going to have to use animals as research models, but they also say we want states and research institutions to considerably invest into alternatives to work towards phasing out the use of animals in research. And I think that's really a crucial aspect that's been so far neglected. And so, for example, the Eurobarometer that's been published in 2016 in the EU is a very nice example of how many people actually support change for animals and how many people really express that more should be done to help both farm and research animals.
Yes, and are lawmakers hearing those views or responding to them adequately?
With regard to the European system, I think it's a bit more complicated because there's some sort of European Union crisis going on right now, right, with Brexit, etc. The EU framework that's been put in place for animals, even though it has progressive features like Article 13 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, that's very revolutionary. Still, there are major deficiencies when it comes to the implementation and enforcement of these directives, and so that's one major issue. And another issue is, of course, other states having joined the EU but not having the necessary framework to actually protect animals. We here in Switzerland have a special situation because we're not part of the EU, right? So we have our very own system of animal protection law. Yeah.
Fascinating. I've just come from Brussels and I've learned a lot about EU politics in the last few days, and it's nothing if not complicated.
Yeah.
Now, Charlotte, I ask everybody who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I am.
Okay. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yep, that unlike many other people, it's not Peter Singer. It's Foxes in the Hen House by David Wolfson and Marion Sullivan.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, that's been my first piece.
It's a good book. Yeah. Oh, good. It was was it a chapter or it was a...
I think it was an article first, and then it was also a chapter in the animal rights book.
Yeah,
published.
They had a law book, didn't they?
Exactly, yeah.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
That was 3R for Farmed Animals. I felt that the research situation was broadly regulated, but less so from a farm animal perspective. And I examined if there are ways of making this concept fruitful for farm animals. Yeah.
Wonderful. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
In terms of scholarship, I think definitely the writings of Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka. I adore and I very much recommend their style of writing. It's very respectful. It's very cautious as well. They are investing a lot into trying to develop what our political and ethical framework would best look like from an animal perspective. That's really hard to do if you're a human, right? But they pay a lot of attention to that, and that's what I really like about them. Yep.
And you don't just say that because Will Kymlicka's your boss.
No. Well, we've just worked together for 1 month right now.
Yes.
So that influence really came from studying his writings, his and her writings, not just our personal interaction. But having said that, I've also had the honor to work together with Professor Kathy Hessler from the Center for Animal Law Studies in Portland, and she has been a wonderful person and a role model in many respects, especially as regards interaction with students and developing and celebrating a very respectful relationship to them. That's been influential for me. Yeah.
Lovely. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think it's very important to have and live a humane agenda, to be a role models in many respects. It's unlike earlier scholars, maybe it's much more important in this Asian time to be a role model in very different respects. So not just in the writings that you do or the teachings that you do, but also how you interact on a personal level. I think it's important for scholarship not just to, we spoke about this briefly before, not just to preach to the choir, but really to also spread the issues that arise with our human-animal interactions to other fields, be it environmental law or international law, or be it investment and trade law, anything that relates to that. And having said that, I also think it's important to include and inform the public. Or, we scholars, we're pretty much funded by institutions or foundations, and that's money that comes from the public, and I think they have a right also to get access to what we produce, and so that's very important, I think.
Yeah. Lovely. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human non-human animal relationship, what would it be? It's an easy question, but it requires a longer answer. I hope that's okay. No, go ahead.
A good friend of mine who's studying at Oxford, he is specialized in experimental psychology, and he's recently published a number of papers on the speciesist bias, right? And so it's very interesting for me to see, no matter how good, well-established and reasonable our moral reasonings are, maybe it's not sufficient because it's in our human psychology just to be biased towards our own self. So I think my biggest wish would be just to remove that speciesist bias.
Wonderful. Yeah. I won't ask you how we're going to do that we don't have time.
Yeah.
So Charlotte, what are you working on next?
Throughout the next year, I will be focusing on the concept of animal labor. So I want to study whether viewing animals as laborers, as workers, would be fruitful to work towards a more just human-animal relationship in the future, whether viewing animals as workers would necessitate that they have workers' rights and representation, for example, too, and what the benefits would be. So my focus really is not on what's usually been done on care or police or military animals. I really want to focus on whether we can view farm animals as workers. That's what I'm interested in, and that's what I think could, potentially induce the biggest change for animals.
Wonderful. So Charlotte, how can people find out more about your work?
Right now, I just actually set up my own homepage 2 days ago.
Oh, wonderful.
It wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be. So that's charlotteblattner.net. And alternatively, you can find my work on academia, my academia profile, but also I try to use Twitter as far as I can. Yes, that's basically where you can view my work. And I also always try to make sure that I publish open access, especially because I think the public should be, exposed to that work. So that's where you can very often you can just Google my work and find it that way too.
And you're a good citizen because you come on podcasts and share your research with people who perhaps aren't really interested in sitting down and reading an academic paper, but would still like to think about the issues anyway.
That makes sense. Well, thank you so much for making that possible with your podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for coming on, Charlotte. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, I say it every fortnight. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. Also, don't forget to tell other people about the podcast. That's a way that we can spread the good word about animal studies, is by letting people know about the podcast and, of course, leaving a review at iTunes. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.